I work as an emergency room nurse in a bustling hospital in the city center. This story took place during one of my night shifts, which started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. The summer night was unusually quiet. As I entered the hospital, the usual noises of the city seemed to fade away, replaced by the sterile atmosphere of the hospital corridors. That night, everything seemed ordinary, with the usual flow of patients and the familiar rhythm of the emergency room. But around 3 a.m. something strange happened. A man in an old trench coat, his face obscured by messy hair, walked into the emergency room. He moved slowly, as if every step was a struggle. His appearance caught my attention. His pale skin and the emptiness in his eyes made me feel uneasy. He handed me his ID card, his hands shaking slightly. The name on the card was John Doe, which only added to the sense of mystery. I led him to the examination room and began the routine checks. As I examined him, I noticed his body was covered in strange bruises and small cuts. When I asked him what had happened, he remained silent, staring at the ceiling with lifeless eyes. Suddenly, without warning, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, and his eyes were filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "They're coming for me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could ask who they were, two men dressed in black suits burst into the emergency room. Their serious expressions and sharp gazes made it clear they were looking for someone. The man on the bed panicked. He pushed me aside and ran towards the back door of the hospital. The men in black chased after him without hesitation. The emergency room, usually filled with noise and activity, fell into an eerie silence. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. A few minutes later, everything seemed to return to normal. The hustle and bustle of the emergency room resumed, as if the strange event had never occurred. But I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. Who were those men? And what had the man in the trench coat been running from? I never saw him again, and the incident was never reported. But that night, a sense of dread lingered in the air, a reminder that the night shift can sometimes bring more than just routine emergencies. Last summer, I chose to forego a summer internship and decided to work at a remote highway rest stop on the outskirts of town. The job primarily involved night shifts from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Although the environment was quiet, I enjoyed the peace. However, all tranquility was shattered one hot summer night. Around 2 a.m., a man on an old motorcycle arrived at the rest stop. He appeared to be in his 40s, with a scruffy face and wearing a worn jacket. As soon as he walked in, the air was filled with a strong smell of smoke and alcohol. He walked straight to the counter, threw a crumpled bill on it, and gruffly said, "Give me a pack of cigarettes." I glanced at the clock and politely responded, "Sorry, but according to regulations, tobacco products cannot be sold between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Upon hearing this, his face immediately darkened, and his eyes showed hostility. He slammed his hand on the counter and yelled, "What kind of stupid rule is that? Who cares about this?" Although I was anxious, I managed to stay calm and explained, "It's the law, and I can't make exceptions." He muttered a curse, grabbed the bill back, and turned to leave. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was over. But soon, I saw through the window that he had called several other motorcyclists. They gathered in the parking lot, started drinking, making noise, and carelessly littering empty bottles and trash on the ground. Watching their increasingly unruly behavior made me feel uneasy. This highway rarely saw any traffic, and being alone at this almost deserted rest stop gave me a sense of isolation and vulnerability. I decided to lock the doors and quietly called the police. 20 minutes later, the police arrived and dispersed the group. Although they didn't return, the fear from that night left me unsettled. The next day, I resigned from my job. I didn't want to face such danger again. In a place like the outskirts, such incidents could recur, and I wasn't willing to take the risk. It was my first real realization that sometimes following the rules might be right but could also lead to trouble. I learned to carefully consider each choice while ensuring my own safety. One day, I was working a night shift at a 24-hour cafe. At night, the cafe was particularly quiet, with very few customers, and I always felt a bit uneasy. However, the job was easy, so I didn't mind the low pay and the dull hours too much. Whenever I worked the night shift alone, I would usually invite a friend to keep me company. He would typically bring his laptop and work while we chatted during slow periods. This made me feel much safer and less lonely. But one day, my friend told me he couldn't make it, so I had to work alone. That night was especially quiet, with almost no customers coming in. I started cleaning the shop, preparing to finish my shift. Suddenly, I saw what looked like a shadow outside the window, but when I went to check, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination and continued working. While I was in the back fetching a mop, I heard the front door open. I called out, saying I'd be right there, but when I came out, the cafe was empty. I thought maybe the customer had gone to the restroom, so I went back to work, but that strange feeling lingered. Soon after, the restroom door opened, and I saw a familiar figure coming out. I felt relieved because it was my friend, who told me he was passing by and decided to drop in. After a brief chat, he ordered a coffee, so I started preparing it. However, while I was making the coffee, I noticed that my friend's expression seemed a bit odd. I asked him if something was wrong, and he just smiled and said he was a bit tired. Though I found it a little strange, I didn't think much of it. The rest of the night went relatively smoothly. Later, I heard that my friend moved away shortly after that night and never came back. Everything seemed normal, but I always felt there was something unusual about that night, and it still occasionally crosses my mind. That night, I once again began my routine patrol. The office building, built decades ago, always seemed to be enveloped in a deathly stillness at night, especially in the basement. The lights there constantly flickered, as though they might go out at any moment. Every time I passed the basement, I would quicken my pace, avoiding the old side door. My colleagues mentioned it led to an abandoned corridor, one that was rarely visited. There were rumors that someone had disappeared there long ago, but I had never taken those stories seriously, brushing them off as nonsense. This night, as I walked by, a low metallic clanging echoed through the hallway. I spun around and saw that the side door, which was never supposed to be open, was slightly ajar. Something inside seemed to be moving. My heart sank, but duty called, and I mustered the courage to investigate. I pushed the door open and stepped into the narrow corridor. A cold draft swept through, and the silence felt oppressive. Just as I entered, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang. I rushed to the door and pulled the handle, but it was locked. I was trapped inside. I tried using my walkie-talkie, but the signal was non-existent down here. Suddenly, the faint light at the end of the corridor flickered, revealing a shadowy figure standing there. It didn't move closer, just lingered, as if waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine. I shouted, hoping someone would hear, but there was no response. The figure suddenly stirred and began walking slowly toward the far end of the corridor, almost as if beckoning me to follow. From the darkness came a dull thudding sound, like someone hammering metal. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't resist moving forward. The fear inside me intensified, and time seemed to stretch endlessly in the dark. Hours later, as morning broke, another guard came to take over the shift and found me locked behind the door, dazed and shaken. He freed me, but whatever had been in that corridor was gone without a trace. Since then, I've never returned to that building, and the secret behind that old door may never be uncovered.